executive producer Lindsay Berra, who of the Netflix documentary "It Ain't Over," who just happens to be the granddaughter of Yogi Berra. Lindsay, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I will tell you transparently that my friend Hodge here said, we've got to get Lindsay Berra on to talk about this documentary. Do you know her? And I said, well, I've met her a couple of times, so that's good. It makes it easy to reach out, and we have mutual friends, so that I was able to catch up to you. I know in the documentary you explain succinctly why you did this documentary, but perhaps you can tell everybody why you did it and the reaction you've had to it since it's been premiered.
I'm gonna go back a little bit. So everybody assumes that the story that opens the documentary, for those who haven't seen it, prior to the 2015 MLB All-Star Game in Cincinnati, Major League Baseball walked out what they called the four greatest living players, and it was Hank Aaron, Johnny Bench, Sandy Koufax, and Willie Mays. And I was sitting in the room watching this all-star game with my very much alive Grandpa Yogi. And I'm like, how can you say that he's not one of the greatest living players? This is insane. And the New York Times says in the movie I was mildly indignant. Well, I was mildly indignant because I really thought that he should have been included. And a lot of people think that that was the impetus for the documentary. But my grandfather passed a few months after that, and I was in the midst of trying to get him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and I was really occupied with other things. And I'm not a filmmaker, so making a movie about that hadn't really crossed my mind. So you fast forward a few years, and there's a guy named Peter Sobloff, who is the big producer of our documentary, It Ain't Over. And he's played in my grandfather's Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center golf outing for many, many years. And he does produce films. And in his words, his wife Imelda dragged him to see the Mr. Rogers documentary. He didn't want to go. This was Won't You Be My Neighbor, which came out in summer of 2018, and he ended up loving it. And the next day at my grandfather's golf outing, he said to my dad and uncles, how come there's no documentary, no Mr. Rogers documentary, but about your dad? And in typical Berra fashion, my dad and my uncles just said, because nobody's ever made one. And that was what got the ball rolling. Peter had produced a film directed by Sean Mullen, our director. Prior to that, Sean played rugby at West Point, so he was a military veteran, just like my grandpa Yogi. And my dad and my uncles loved him immediately. Sean's a big teddy bear of a human being. You can't not like Sean. And I met him shortly thereafter and started just, if we're going to do this, I was saying you have to, you got to get Roger Angel and Vin Scully and Audrey Graziola and Tony Kubek and Bobby Richardson and Hector Lopez. And these are not people, young people. So you have to hurry up, and you don't know them. So you need me. And that was how I got involved, really from a logistical perspective at the beginning of the documentary. But I think the idea from the beginning was to, first of all, remind people what a great baseball player my grandfather was, because I do think his personality overshadowed his on-field accomplishments, but then also to remind folks that as great as he was on the field, he was an even better human being. And the other goal was to not make this a baseball movie. There's baseball in it, but it really is a movie about, as Sean says, a life well lived. And it's a typically American life that so many folks can relate to. And that was a long answer, so I apologize.
That's all right. That's what
I'm going
podcasts are for.
I'm going to toss in a little aside here and then ask you something else about the film. But Michael Farber, whom you may know.
Yeah, I love Michael.
Well, so do we. I told Michael that you were coming on today, and he said, I have one story that you can tell or not tell, up to me. And I didn't know if we would have time, but here we go. After you talked about your grandfather being the human being he was, beyond the baseball player he was. And Michael told a story of the 1978 spring training in Fort Lauderdale, mid-50s morning, kind of chilly. And Michael said he was battling a cold and he was shivering outside the dugout. And Yogi approached him, took off his blue satin Yankee jacket and said, here, kid, And Michael's final comment was, "Love the man ever since." So so there you go. As for Yogi Berra, the baseball player, it makes no sense that a winner of 10 World Series titles doesn't get the recognition due him. But there are reasons. If he was 6 inches taller, if he was built like Johnny Bench, it's different. It's wrong because Yogi's short stature and build should have made him stand out and get even more credit given his accomplishments. But that was one reason. And then there's the matter of Yogiisms that sort of took over. They made him more famous than the World Series titles, I guess. How much did that bother you, and how much did that bother him?
I actually don't think it bothered him as much as it bothers me. Um, I say this a lot about my grandpa Yogi, but he, first generation Italian immigrant from a very poor family. He would tell you that his three older brothers were better than he was at baseball, but they all had to work to help support the family. And then they ganged up on my great grandfather and said one of them should have a chance to play baseball. And that was why Grandpa Yogi got the chance. So he was incredibly grateful for and aware of the sacrifice that his brothers had made for him. He volunteers to serve his country in the Navy in World War II and ends up off of Omaha Beach during the D-Day invasion. And, when you see videos of D-Day with all the bullets and all the bombs, like he was right there offshore providing machine gun cover fire for our troops, and then spent a bunch of days afterwards pulling the bodies of his fallen comrades out of the water. And then he did all that again in the invasion of southern France. And I think that he was very keenly aware of the fact that there were many, many, many men who did not come home from that experience. And he was able to come home and meet and marry my grandmother, who everybody said, he was dating up and he didn't deserve her and whatever. So he comes home and gets the girl and ends up playing a kid's game for a living. And I don't think that there was a single day that went by that he didn't consider how profoundly blessed he was to be living any life, and specifically that life. And I think what people said or thought about him after that, like, kind of just didn't matter, right? Like the perspective that he brought to every day was such that, all right, you think I'm too ugly to be a Yankee? To hell with you. I still don't know what that one means.
Well,
and,
when you're between DiMaggio and Mantle,
well, I guess
when you're
maybe. I think
between
Grandpa was
DiMaggio and
kind of
Mantle,
cute.
yeah.
But regardless of whether you think he looked like a fire hydrant or a gargoyle, the guy was a great hitter and a great winner. And he knew that. He was profoundly confident in himself without being, having any ego. And I think it didn't really matter to him what people said. For us, for like my dad and my uncles and me, when I hear people now talking about the greatest catchers of all time, the greatest players of all time, I just don't like that he's really disappeared from that conversation. He deserves to be in that conversation.
Well, he hasn't disappeared now. I can tell you that.
Well,
I have
Your project fulfilled its purpose. There's no question about that. I'm curious, in your time sitting on the sofa with your grandfather, when he was watching games, would he talk about the game as a manager? Would he talk about the game as a catcher? And what could you glean from that?
Oh my God. Honestly, watching baseball games, they say talking to Yogi Berra about baseball is like talking to Homer about the gods. And like, I don't remember who said that, but it is profoundly true. Like he just would see things. I'd roll over to his house at like, 10:30, 11 o'clock after like a club soccer game or something I'd play, and I would steal the leftovers off their stove and sit on the couch, and he'd be watching like the Yankees playing in Oakland, the late West Coast game. And he was just able to pick out, you know, flaws with hitters just by like looking at the way they stood in the box. He would tell you what a pitcher was going to throw. If he didn't do it, what he should have thrown. He would talk about where fielders should or shouldn't have been positioned. He was always thinking, 3 or 4 moves ahead with the managers. Like he just had such an intuitive understanding of the game. And a lot of times, I mean, I learned a ton sitting there listening to him, But a lot of times, like he'd say something, you'd be like, wait, what is he talking about? And then it would happen. And you're like, oh my God, he was like, he had some kind of like baseball ESP. But you hear like Nick Swisher and Derek Jeter and these younger folks who Grandpa got to be friends with later in his life talk about what it was like having him on the bench, and he would just pick out some little thing in their stance or just some weird way they were thinking about the game that wasn't right, and he would point out, oh, just think about this. And Nick would say like, and he told me to move up 6 inches in the box, and I hit the best I ever hit for an entire season, right? Like he was, I don't know what he was saying, he was late on curveballs or something. But yeah, Grandpa just was able to pick out the little things and just, he was able to see the minutia, but also see the forest for the trees. He just, baseball was in his blood.